full attention, Kenneth.
Well, I'm proud of you. I can get your full attention. The question is everybody else.
Hey!
Yeah. Hey, everybody.
People.
Yeah, I put one of the small duck's squeakers into this huge duck.
Oh, no wonder.
Yeah. All right. Well, welcome to the spring semester. I hope y'all's first day was tolerable. I had nothing today. Good. Okay. Well, cool.
Cold, I'm sure.
We have a really great semester planned up, and I brought the schedule. So if anybody after the meeting wants to take a picture of this, then go ahead. It will also be posted publicly. But we have a really good schedule. William Lane Craig is going to be here, or we're going to be calling him on Zoom, as is Tim McGrew. A lot of fun stuff that is planned for this semester, and a lot of fun stuff to be promoted as well. So, you know, the best way, the early church tells us that the best way to let people know about something is just by word of mouth. So I'd like to invite all of y'all to just consider spreading the word about the existence of our group, especially with people that you might end up in conversation with who are interested in the evidence for faith and things like that. If you're looking for the SOC meeting, it's on the other side. Yeah. So there are business cards over there. Please grab a couple, put them in your wallet or whatever, so that whenever the conversation arises, you can give them to them, and because that's what we want to be, yeah?
Someone's asking for the live stream for tonight.
Oh, I forgot to put the link out. You want to do that, or do you want me to do it after I sit down? I'll do it after I sit down because I have more of the stuff. Just let them know I'll put it out. Okay, well, cool. What else did I have? I don't think I had all that much in terms of plans, but we are going to Panda tonight, and yeah, there we go. Okay, well, very good. I'll hand it over to Alan because we're going to start out on archaeology.
After you mentioned it there.
Yeah. Oh, you were showing the schedule. Sweet.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, we're going to be talking about archaeology tonight. So I read several books and looked at a lot of videos by archaeologists over the break. I took a grad school class at Biola on archaeology about 10 years ago or so. But anyway, before we get into that, though, we could highlight a couple things about the schedule for the semester. This is what's upcoming. So this is part of sort of a two-part series. Tonight we're going to hit the Old Testament. Next week, the New Testament. And then we're going to have Dr. Justin Bass give a talk. It's not about archaeology, but it's about Dietrich Bonhoeffer. As many of you know, he was the Christian pastor in Nazi Germany, that one of the few there that really stood up against Hitler, and it cost him his life. And there's some good lessons for today in applying some of those things that Dr. Bass will share with us. And then we're really pleased to have Dr. Tim McGrew, who some of you have heard in person. He's really top philosopher, really strong Christian intellectual. He's going to zoom in. He lives in Michigan, and talk about why science doesn't disprove miracles. And then we're going to do this intelligent design series as well. And we're really excited to be able to have Seth talk about fine-tuning. And we're going to talk about the evidence for the soul, if you've never heard that talk. This one's going to be more focused on neuroscience, a little bit different than what we did in the last year or two. So I think you'll find it pretty interesting. It's kind of build on what we've talked about before here, but he'll give a brief intro if you didn't catch that. But there's a surprisingly strong case you can make for something beyond the physical from neuroscience. And then, yeah, we have Dr. Craig coming up. We're going to talk about Islam. We usually cover at least some world religion, or one or more this semester, probably just one. And then we're going to obviously go over the resurrection like we usually do near Easter each year. So lots of good stuff coming up. But let's jump in then to archaeology. And first of all, maybe a bit of intro just about like what can you show or not show from archaeology. So it is an interesting aspect of apologetics or evidence for Christianity because it's really hard to fake. You dig up something from 2,500 years ago or whatever, and if you can authenticate it in terms of, it's buried with other stuff from a certain era, it's pretty compelling that, this is probably not something that was faked. And so you get a certain amount of interesting information from that kind of study. And it can provide significant insight into biblical culture, sometimes how to interpret the Bible as we understand better these ancient cultures. And it's a way of testing the accuracy of the Bible. Now, I would want to emphasize it's a very incomplete record from archaeology, as we'll talk about in just a minute in more detail. So your samples are not that great in terms of you don't cover every possible event in the Bible. But where you can check it at all, we have a long history of showing that the Bible actually is quite accurate, much more so than the skeptics have tried to argue. But I would like to quote from Ed Yamauchi, who's pointed out how we really just have a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of ancient evidence. And by that, he's referring to one of the fractions would be just that most artifacts did not survive their own time. Okay, so certain things that were buildings or written records or whatever are often destroyed, they're recycled. Ancient people were really better at recycling than we are today, even though we think of ourselves as being eco-friendly. It was more out of necessity as you were poor that you're going to try to reuse things. So there's that aspect of just they're no longer with us. And then the ravages of time obviously is another one. They could be buried where you can't find them and things like that. And then often we actually know of these ancient sites, often called tells. There'll be some mound. People know there was an ancient city there, but no one's ever excavated it, for example. Which actually is kind of good in some ways because the early archaeologists were too destructive. They didn't know how to do it right. We've gotten better over time. Maybe it's not all bad that we're waiting for technology to catch up before we go in this evasive process of digging things up. But even among those that have been excavated, there's also this fractional aspect where not all of it has even been published. And you'll maybe see that even as we're going through some of this evidence. It's like, well, this was dug up 30 years ago, but they just now got around to really seeing what it was or something. Or like there's this famous P52, oldest manuscript of the New Testament. It was sitting around in a museum forever, and they didn't really realize what they had until somebody saw it and said, hey, that's Greek. That's the book of John. Pretty cool. So what are the implications of this then if you have such a small sample? For example, some skeptics will often claim, well, we don't have any ancient evidence of X or blank, fill in the blank, and therefore they would say the Bible's wrong. What's the problem with that if you have a very incomplete record? I mean, it's pretty obvious, but okay, well said, in fact. That's my next slide. I didn't tell him to say that either. I did add the word necessarily. Like, okay, in some cases, evidence of absence could be, or absence of evidence could be evidence of absence. Like if I say there's an elephant in this room, you could tell whether that's true or not. But if I say there's the COVID virus in this room, it's like, well, who knows, right? Probably is at least a few particles. So anyway, though, with respect to, obviously based on what I just shared, this very incomplete record, if you're just arguing from an absence of evidence, anything archaeologically is going to be weak, especially the further back you go in time, right? So there's a long history where people made these kind of arguments and they were later shown to be false as well. But my prof, he used to talk about this fact, just think about if your house was burned, looted, flooded, and endured earthquakes, and then you wait thousands of years, what would you find? I mean, yeah, it's really, really hard. And there are a lot of earthquakes in the ancient biblical areas, especially like if you go up to Turkey. I know when I was touring there not that long ago, there's hardly anything that could withstand the various earthquakes they have, as well as like Greece. But I think we can show some things, but again, a little bit more on what it can't show. We can't prove the Bible's divinely inspired. We can't prove some of the miracles, but we can show, that if you have a pattern where the Bible is shown to be truthful, where you can check it. That does increase the confidence. That gives you more evidence that the whole thing is true, if you can, provide some of that. So it's certainly worth exploring this record. And we're getting new data all the time. I mean, every year, if you just watch a YouTube video on like the top 10 archaeological discoveries about the Bible this year, it's pretty interesting. Like every year, you're getting like 10. Some of them are more significant than others, but you're getting some additional information that seems to corroborate the claims of the Bible. All right, just one example. The rest of the time we'll be looking at other things other than how archaeology helps biblical interpretation, but wanted to give you one example in this area, and that would be this. As you might recall, in the book of Exodus, it talks about the Pharaoh having a hardening of the heart, and sometimes it says God did it, and sometimes it says Pharaoh did it, but there is actually an interesting backdrop to that as well that ties into Egyptian culture, in that they had this concept, which is often called the negative confession. You can see in this sort of background picture here. Oops, I was trying to use the pointer. That was good. Sorry. There we go. You can see there's like a weighing of the heart, and they have this god Anubis and so forth. The heart was weighed against the feather of truth or justice, and if it was heavy because of sin, then it would affect you wouldn't be able to go to the best afterlife. There's some of that kind of thing going on. So when you say Pharaoh's heart is hardened, that's actually also a way of saying, well, he's very sinful. And so there's that whole element to that story as well, where it seems like that might be one of the factors in why it's using that kind of language there. Maybe, you could argue, well, maybe not. Maybe it's just also trying to convey that God was forcing these events to happen or something, but I think this definitely ties into that. So what we're going to basically look at are some of the biggest challenges to the Old Testament. There's not enough time to obviously get into all the details, but Exodus, right? A lot of skeptical scholars really challenge the Exodus. Like they'll say things like, oh, we have no evidence for the Exodus, or the early conquest, right, of the Promised Land. Jericho was often one of the things that was attacked a lot. So we're going to look at that in some detail, especially because that's the story within that whole conquest narrative that has the most details. And it's kind of an interesting one, right? You would maybe hear it in Sunday school if you grew up in a Christian home. And we'll look a little bit at the early history of Israel, because even going back to Solomon and David, there's a history of scholars pushing back and saying, hey, we don't think David even existed. And we'll look at why they've had to backtrack on that. And we'll go a little bit briefly beyond that to the newer parts if we have time. But yeah, let's dig into the Exodus. The first thing I would like to have us think through, though, is, okay, if we're looking for evidence actually in the desert wanderings, we should have pretty low expectations, right? Because you just had these slaves coming out of Egypt, wandering around who knows where, and then they finally make it to the Promised Land in 40 years. But they didn't have a lot of possessions, right? They were slaves. I mean, the Egyptians gave them some stuff, but that would just look like Egyptian stuff, right? You wouldn't have distinctive Hebrew stuff. They were wandering around in tents. They weren't building buildings and lasting artifacts. There's probably big incentive for them to not just leave stuff around, right? Clothes, they would want to make sure they don't leave artifacts around because they need them to stay alive and so forth. So I don't think we should expect to see a lot of evidence there. But what we can look at is whether or not we have evidence of Hebrews and Semitic peoples in Egypt and as slaves in a proper time frame. And then if we can show, well, actually they show up in the Promised Land also in the time frame the Bible claims, well then, by deductive reasoning, we know they must have traveled from one to the other. So there must have been some form of an exodus. And that's probably about as good as you're going to be able to corroborate that account. But I think that's really significant if you can show that. And I argue that we do have some fairly good evidence when you factor in, again, this being so long ago and things like that. I think you'll see that it's actually surprisingly good at this point. All right. The first issue to discuss is the time frame. There are two different theories among even evangelical scholars with respect to when the Exodus occurred. There's one school of thought that wants to, there's sort of a so-called early and a so-called late Exodus. So some people latched on to the fact that in Exodus 1:11, it speaks of the city of Ramses. And so if you look at, well, when did Ramses II and this city associated with him really come to prominence? It's about in this kind of 13th century BC era. So some people say, well, maybe he was the Pharaoh of the Exodus. It must have happened then. But really, if you look carefully at the whole rest of the Old Testament, I think you end up with a different story. For example, 1 Kings 6:1 talks about exactly when Solomon's temple was constructed. And then you have verses that talk about, well, it does talk about this being 480 years after the Exodus. And you have other places actually in Scripture as well that I didn't show here, where it essentially shows you a time frame that would push the Exodus back to about 1446 BC. Okay, so I think that's actually the accurate one. And there's a simple explanation for this reference to Ramses. And it's likely just an editor came along later, right? You're copying this manuscript down over time. No one knows what city you're referring to unless you say, oh, this is now known as the city of Ramses. It doesn't attack biblical inerrancy. God could inspire the editors as well, but it seems to be the case. And we have other examples of this actually that are even more clear. For example, in Genesis 14:14, it mentions the city of Dan, but Dan wasn't even born until later, and it actually says that it was only renamed Dan from Laish in Judges 18:27. So that also seems to be a simple case where an editor, probably copying Genesis for this current generation, wanted them to understand, what city are you talking about? They wouldn't have known Laish. They would know where Dan is. And he just said, well, this is the city of Dan. Okay, so I think the same thing was going on here with respect to this Ramses city. Okay, so what evidence do we have of slaves in Egypt? We do, it's certainly pretty well established there was a number of Semitic slaves in Egypt. The term Semitic is a little broader than Hebrews, but the fact is sometimes you can't distinguish, which type of person east of Egypt in this Palestine region were you really dealing with, right? They look the same, they're genetically similar. But actually the Brooklyn Papyrus is a very interesting document. And this is basically a list of slaves or servants that Egyptians had. And within here, we do see a number of Semitic names, but we also see names that are specifically Hebrew. So that's where you can get a little more distinguishing than just seeing some Egyptian pictures or paintings or things of that nature. You're actually getting a number of names that match early biblical names. For example, you might remember one of the midwives was named Shiphrah. And so we see that name in this papyrus. You see names corresponding to Jacob, something very similar to David, Eve, Asher, Issachar, and even the word Hebrew itself, which, well, the first reference to Abraham talks about him as being a Hebrew. So that's pretty compelling evidence for showing, hey, there was actually Hebrew slaves in Egypt, and it is in the right time frame based on the early Exodus hypothesis in terms of timing. All right, yeah, and you have a lot of other documents that shows, at least at the level of Semites, a broader level than Hebrews, that you had that in this 18th dynasty of Egypt. And you have specifically documentation showing, like, hey, they enslaved these people, they made mud bricks, they were involved in construction projects and agriculture, very similar to the account in Exodus in terms of the kinds of things the Egyptians would force the slaves to do. All right, we also have something interesting from the first century Jewish historian Josephus, and we unfortunately don't have the original work that he quotes, but that's a common problem when you go back this far. For example, even in the first century AD, most books referenced by first century writings we do have no longer exist. You have like less than half of them. But anyway, this was a 3rd century work that he's quoting from by an Egyptian historian named Manetho. And that historian named Amenhotep as the Pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay, and so I think that's the hypothesis I would want to go with and that I find most compelling as I look at archaeologists, looking at this evidence. It would be Amenhotep, specifically the second. So this fits the account in multiple ways. One is that his father lived over 40 years, which is pretty rare among pharaohs in terms of their dynasty reign. And yet, if you remember the account there in Exodus, it talks about how, he forgot Moses, or that, it had to be a long time. Moses killed the person. He went away for 40 years, came back after that Pharaoh died. So there was like a long duration of that reign. Also, the successor of Thutmose III was not the oldest son, which was very rare. Those cultures, like you see in the Old Testament, they generally favored the oldest son. But that would be, of course, consistent on the hypothesis that that was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, because the biblical account claims that his oldest son died in the 10th plague. We do also see the military suddenly declining in that era and the palace being abandoned. And then we have this very Pharaoh documenting. There's just 2 things that document about his warlike. He's involved in wars twice that we know of from documentation that survives. And one of them is a slave raid that would have been just after the Exodus, where he's trying to get slaves from the Canaan area, or toward that area anyway. And this is recorded on this elephantine stele. And so that's kind of interesting, especially he claims like a large number of them and things like that. It's like he's trying to save face. A lot of scholars think it was exaggerated. But either way, it would sort of fit the biblical account, because there would have been a lot of slaves that escaped. He would have been in a position where he would want to claim that. Maybe he did. Maybe it was successful. Don't know for sure, but it's pretty interesting that that's one of the things claimed by that Pharaoh. Now, with respect to the plagues, it's interesting that we do have some Egyptian record that seems to match the plagues. Now, this is controversial. A lot of this people will push back on, just to give you that warning. Like if you got there, a lot of the secular scholars will try to push back on some of this evidence. But I think all of this evidence I'm presenting gives you evidence toward the Exodus. Any one piece of it may not be decisive, but you put it all together, it's a pretty good cumulative case. In this case, the main issue is that this document is dated to a pretty wide range. And I think a lot of scholars they're like, oh, the Bible is made up. Maybe this is made up. There's no way it could be coinciding. But if you read it, you do see the Nile turn to blood. You see these descriptions of death everywhere, this kind of famine and intense suffering. It doesn't, enumerate them as the exact 10, but you get like 4 or 5 of them pretty much the same. It's pretty compelling, actually. So that's the admonitions of Ippur. Probably butchering the pronunciation there, but that's pretty interesting. So I think there's a good argument that it's at least possible in the right time frame to match. It's just not very specific. Okay, the Hebrews in the Exodus account were said to live in the land of Goshen, as you might remember if you're familiar with that. And the city where they lived is likely what is referred to as Avaris. Okay? And in that area, we actually have a number of markers that seem to validate and confirm this. This was known to be primarily a home to Semitic peoples. Again, if you look at the secular archaeologists, they wouldn't necessarily identify them as Hebrew because the markers are more ambiguous. It's more of this people from the Canaan area were living here at that time. But the pottery and weapons were definitely matching that area. And there's evidence. This is where you get more specifically Hebrew evidence if you look at some dietary and burial practices. Most everybody except for the Jews would eat pigs. You'd have pig bones lying around. So when you see absence of those kind of things, that's a good marker for the Hebrews. And that's one of the examples. Yeah.
So this would
Yeah, I mean, it would be before they were encoded into the Mosaic Law, so it's a good point. But it may well be that some of those were still being practiced, before they were passed along as the official, yeah. And the burial traditions also, I think, were, a good indicator here. Yeah. Ruins of houses that match Hebrew four-room type architecture is also something that is found there. And then there's a very sudden departure from the city that seems to be in the right time frame. And again, here, when I say the right time frame, it's not as though archaeologists can nail it down to 1446 BC. It's more of, 15th century, all of a sudden a lot of people are gone kind of thing. So, all right, and then if you look at early Israel references archaeologically, you find some pretty interesting things that seem to only fit if it was an early Exodus and that fit the Bible quite well. One of the key artifacts is the Merneptah stele, and this records a pharaoh's victory over Israel in the 13th century BC. So this would be more in like the time of Judges and that kind of a thing. But it has a reference there to some of the peoples. I think it talks about them conquering some in Libya on the other side of Egypt, and it talks about this pharaoh also conquering in Canaan. But it mentions Israel as like the main people in that area of Canaan, which fits the Bible quite well and doesn't fit those skeptical scholars that try to argue, oh, Israel just kind of showed up later or something out of those people. And it's interesting too, my professor, I remember, and I did some more research on this, but it uses an interesting term for Israel there. There's some markers in hieroglyphics where you use like hills if it's a land area, but if it's more of like a nomadic people, you leave that out. You show some things for like foreign people. And so actually it fits even better with Israel at that time as being a nomadic people group and not like, oh, well, we know these people, like other ones on this stele, it'll show them with the hills, like, oh yeah, they were living in this area, they were more static, they weren't nomadic. So that's kind of interesting. And it does show Israel as the most powerful in that area. So there's a few things. It's not real lengthy in terms of what it says about Israel, but everything it does say seems to fit. And it's a very early artifact. There's not that many artifacts about any people. If you go back to the 13th century BC, there's not a lot out there. But yeah, here's one where we have a lot of data actually, and it's the Amarna letters. We read this some in grad school, and it's pretty interesting. They found 382 letters written by people in the area of Canaan, which at that time was sort of ruled or had some control, some tie-ins to Egypt. And so they were appealing to the Pharaoh like, hey, come help us. These Haburu people are attacking us, or there's a lot of stuff going on where they needed help. Apparently the Egyptians were not helping them much either. And we see a drop in population of the Canaanites during this time frame, which would correspond to the time frame of the book of Judges. And they're being replaced by a civilization without pigs. And here, this would be after the Mosaic Law is known, so maybe a little more solid of a marker from that aspect. So these were in cuneiform. And the term itself, Haburu, it may not really necessarily mean just like Hebrews. It seems to be a term that some scholars say is like, it could just be like more of like an invader, or it might be a nomadic thing. Others say, well, maybe they called them that because they were primarily Hebrews. So it's not real clear. We're not going to read a whole lot into the name, but we want to look more at what they said about them. And if you study that in detail, there's a pretty compelling case for how it matches Judges. They say things like, all the lands of the king have been deserted, lost are all the mayors, the Haburu have plundered the lands, they're stronger than us, they destroy us. Those are pretty generic. That's not too good so far. But here's where it really gets good. If you look at the details, and you can look this up online, the Armstrong Institute, Archaeological Institute in Jerusalem has documented this quite well, where they've showed, I'm not going to go through this for sake of time for all the cities, but for all these ones listed and shown over here, it shows how what it says in the Amarna letters actually matches the book of Judges quite well. And it's pretty interesting. It's pretty compelling, because some of the cities, it's like they fell quickly or they didn't fall until late. Jerusalem fell like last. I mean, the timing and what it's saying about them totally matches. So like one of them talks about they fight in a coalition in the Amarna letters, and just like the Bible says that as well, most cities that were discussed in Judges were not necessarily forming coalitions, but this one was, and that's what the Amarna letters say. So really every one of these, it's like, it's a pretty good match. There's some confirmation there. And yeah, you end up with a lot of these. So there's like 15 different of these kind of little cities, and you've got a very consistent message there. So that, at that level of detail, I think it's a pretty good confirmation. So that was a chaotic time, right? If you read the book of Judges, it's like the people were not necessarily really following God that well, but they would have a judge that would come up and conquer the people that were oppressing the Israelites, and there was a lot of warfare going on. It was a time of great chaos, and that's very consistent with the spirit of what the Amarna letters discusses. So that's pretty interesting as well. All right, there's actually an earlier reference to Israel. Most scholars think that I've seen, although it's a little more controversial, because part of it was cut off, and it's called the Berlin pedestal. But if you look at the Merneptah stele that we're just talking about, it mentions Canaan, Ashkelon, and Israel in succession. And we've got two of the three here. And then Israel, it looks the same. It's just a little bit cut off. So you can see, like, if you were to show Israel fully, what it would look like. And it seems to match for the part that we have it. So that seems somewhat compelling. But again, you don't have to take this. It's not 100% evidence. You can have evidence for some hypothesis, even if there's some uncertainty. That's just the way Bayesian probability theory works. That's the way evidence is best evaluated. There's also a couple of interesting inscriptions that are referred to as the nomads of Yahweh. Yahweh, of course, being the ancient personal name of God that was so holy, they didn't ever want to write it down and so forth. And we have an inscription in Soleb, what is now northern Sudan, but the ancient Egyptian sort of country, if you want to call it that, would have included this area as well. And this is dated all the way back to 1400 BCE. So that's really close to the Exodus, like just after it. This was part of a temple built to honor Amenhotep III. So the second was the one that was the Pharaoh of the Exodus, we think. But it lists enemies of Egypt, including the animal herding nomads of Yahweh. So that sounds familiar. The Hebrews are the only ancient people that worshipped Yahweh, so it's not, I don't think, referring to any other people group. And this would confirm the early over the late hypothesis. You might remember the Pharaoh was said to, he's never heard of Yahweh when Moses and Aaron are talking to him. He's like, who's this Yahweh God you're talking about? And yet here you have slightly later Pharaoh talking about Yahweh. And it's so close in time that gives you confirmation that, hey, Israel actually was around as a people group this early on, despite what some skeptics want to claim. So putting all this together, Dr. Titus Kennedy, he's got a lot of good videos out there. If you guys want to check those out for more information, I can make available this PowerPoint, but it kind of summarizes here some of the key inscriptions, most of which we talked about, but not all. Like there's also this Ebal curse tablet, which is dated to somewhere between 1400, 1200 BC. And it's got some language about, people being cursed that aren't following Yahweh. The Israelites, they agreed to follow Joshua 1. He's like, choose you this day whom you will serve. They all agreed. And then it was, there was sort of a blessing if you follow God, a cursing if you don't. But it was something they sort of signed on to, so to speak. So if you look at the conquest of Palestine in more detail, as the Israelites moved into the Promised Land from Egypt, you see, from an archaeological standpoint, not just the Amarna letters describing it, we actually see that the cities that said were destroyed by fire, for example, you've got 3 cities that were burned in Joshua, and in every one of them we find 15th century evidence for a significant burned city event. Now, sometimes cities were burned, so you could have other cases where people burned stuff other than this, but the fact that you have all 3 of those, and many of the other cities were not burned in that time frame, that's some level of evidence, okay? Hatzor in particular, we have decent evidence. I think that was a conquest by Joshua and his followers, as described in the book of Joshua. There's a mention of this Jabin leader here of Hatzor. And then you also have this interesting case where the idols found there have their heads chopped off. Okay, so really only the Hebrews, ancient Hebrews, would do that. Most other ancient peoples, they would sort of hedge their bets, right? They might have believed in their God over other gods. Our God's more powerful. Most of them were polytheists, though. They were quick to believe in these other gods, and they wouldn't want to necessarily offend them or make them mad. So as far as I know, there's no examples of them chopping off heads of idols that were never anybody other than the Hebrew people, because of course, they have this very powerful anti-idol kind of thing. It's in the 10 Commandments and so forth. So, one of the archaeologists, Yigael Yadin, he was kind of frustrated with some of the skeptical minimalist archaeologists. He said, everyone is a potential destroyer of Hatzor if not mentioned in any document except those specifically mentioned in the Bible as having done so. So people have these theories like, oh, maybe it was the Egyptians that chopped them off, but they found Egyptian idols there. Why would they chop off the heads of their own idols? And sometimes I think there is some irrationality applied by some that want to just diminish the Bible. And I think he's more of a secular Jew. It's not like he had this huge bias or anything. I know his father was definitely an atheist archaeologist. But yeah, let's dive in a little bit deeper to Jericho, which is especially interesting, right? Because we've got more details in the Bible about how it fell and things like that. And this is one of the early battles that you see recorded in the book of Joshua. And we know exactly where Jericho was. It's one of the ancient cities of the world, most ancient. There's not a lot of ambiguity because it's in this really dry area. It's probably the lowest elevation city in the whole world, in fact. It's kind of down there by the Dead Sea, as you can see here, very low-lying area. But as a reminder, in the Joshua 6 account there, it talks about the walls coming down, when they blew the trumpets and so forth. And it was a very sudden thing, right? They went around 7 days, and on the 7th day is when things came down. They were told to burn the city, don't loot it, don't claim things as your own. Okay, and this happened during the springtime. This is recorded right after they had a sort of miraculous crossing of the Jordan River when it was at its peak, which was the springtime. So we know even the season where this supposedly happened, and we know some attributes that would be unusual in ancient warfare if you were to find them. For example, obviously most examples, there's a lot of examples, right, of ancient people, overthrowing some walled city. But what do they usually do? They usually get their battering rams, knock down the walls fall to the inside, right, because they're coming from the outside. And then they loot everything. They're like, I'm going to steal everything here, right? So if you find a city that wasn't looted and the walls fall outward instead of inward, that's going to be pretty good evidence. And that's exactly what we find here. So you have a number of archaeologists who have excavated this, starting with some Germans. Garstang was one of the early ones, and then Kathleen Kenyon came in. She questioned the timing with respect to the biblical account, but then later others like Bryant Wood showed that her hypothesis was based on some missing pottery, and she should have just dated the pottery they had there. He's a pottery expert, and he showed that actually it was the right time frame. But anyway, so Garstang, he said the main fact then remains there's no doubt the walls fell outward so completely the attackers would be able to clamber up and over the ruins of the city. This is remarkable. The city walls fall inward, not outward. And so you've got that aspect of the walls. It's suggestive of a very sudden collapse. There's a thick layer of soot at the site that supports the idea that the city was burned, not simply conquered. And they even had an article in Time magazine, back before it was so anti-Christian as it is today, but it was called Score One for the Bible, commenting on how this really matched the biblical account. All right, so yeah, here's a brief mention of Kathleen Kenyon's excavation later. I could go in more detail offline if anybody wants to know more about that, but I've even got some backup slides on that. But yeah, we have really good evidence, I think, that this was sort of more towards around 1400 BC. Again, you can't date it super precisely, but you can date it within, a 50-year window or something that would match the Exodus perfectly. All right, there was one portion of that mud brick wall that was left intact, and even that matches the account, right? Because you had Rahab being preserved with her family and so forth. And yeah, you had these things burned and not looted. That's so unusual. They found these large stores of grain, which also, in the spring, you probably would have had large, just after the barley harvest, you would have had these large stores of grain, and they were burned, not looted. There was no long siege. Usually it would take a while before you'd even try to attack one of these ancient walled cities, kind of let them starve out, weaken, then we'll go in later. But yet this was a very quick siege, matches the account in the Bible exactly. This is one of the actual drawings from one of the archaeological expeditions showing kind of the fallen bricks and so forth, and a section of the wall. And then this is actually some of the actual pictures that they took of these jars, these large jars where they stored some grain, and showing that they were burned. They had some stuff inside of them as well. So, they've documented this pretty well. You've got some pretty good evidence for these kinds of things. Any questions on that so far, or comments or anything? Okay, so what about as you go a little bit further in time, after you get past Judges, you finally have Israel wanting kings, and you have Samuel and God are like, okay, you guys are going to have a lot of problems with these kings, but we're going to let you have them. And you had Saul, and then David and Solomon, and then the kingdom splits. So some skeptical scholars want to say, oh, the Jews were in exile in Babylon, and they made these stories up just to try to get some kind of national unity. And they have these kind of wild stories that really don't have any evidence supporting them, but some scholars kind of locked onto them and said, yeah, we doubt there was ever even a David. Now, keep in mind, one of the interesting things about the Old Testament, too, is that it documents the embarrassing failures of all these leaders, right? I mean, David with Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite, he sort of, basically murdered him indirectly. And Saul was, very bad leader according to the Bible. He had all these mistakes, and Solomon, fell away with his foreign wives and all that kind of stuff. I mean, these were all very flawed creatures. If you're making up a story, would you really make all of your leaders so flawed? So anyway, though, we finally have now, in the last several decades, we've started to get more and more evidence for David and Solomon. But let's talk mostly about King David, since he preceded him. So starting in about 1993 was the first time we found this so-called Tel Dan inscription, pictured at the bottom right there. It talks about an Aramaean king, Hazael, bragging about defeating Judah, the southern kingdom, in an inscription dated to about the 9th century BC. This would have been about 150 years after David, but they're still referring, you see that in the Old Testament as well, right? The house of David, you have this succession of rulers descended from David, ultimately going all the way to the Messiah later, but he's still calling it, the house of David. So this is very, the account even of this Aramaean king defeating Israel, that matches 2 Kings 8 and 9 quite well. But yeah, it's mostly we want to highlight, for purposes of discussion here, this reference to the house of David. So yeah, it must have been well known and influential in this time frame. And we've had other ones too. We've had other inscriptions that have this as well. There's still a few scholars that push. Most of them have, sort of conceded, okay, David must have existed. There's still a few that try to resist it, even though we've got several now that all reference this. There's another one referenced there, and we're going to mention another one on a future slide. So we've got them in Syria and Egypt, as well as, very close to Israel, such as this one. I mean, you even have, NBC News reporting on this as unequivocal evidence of a kingdom's existence, things like that. Well, let's talk about the Mesha stele, or this is also known as the Moabite stone. There's an interesting backstory we don't really have time to get into on this, in terms of it was destroyed by some ancient people and they had to sort of reassemble it. But they were able to, so we know what was there, and he took an imprint before they did. But this is dated also to about the 9th century BC, or BCE as they like to call it these days. And this references the house of David as well. And again, it has an account here that matches the 1 Kings 16 in this case quite well, where it talks about Omri, the king of Moab, basically had a successful battle against the king of Moab named Mesha had a successful battle against Omri and defeated him. In this, it also references the tribe of Gad, the house of Israel, and Yahweh. So we're getting a lot of confirmations with the early biblical account. All right, so this is also pretty good evidence. Now this next one is kind of a fun one. That's kind of funny actually. It's the so-called Lachish latrine. So in 2 Kings, it talks about how they demolished this sacred stone of Baal, tore down the temple, and the people used it for a latrine. Okay, so that's kind of interesting. And sure enough, we found artifacts that date to the right time here. This would have been under the reign of King Hezekiah. And it has things in there that reference Hezekiah, so we know it was that time frame, matching the Bible. And we find these 4-horned altars that were sort of in violation of the rules of Israel, and so they cut off the horns and so forth. And you find the latrine. We've got the latrine there. So one of the articles I read had a title of like, "Holy crap!" And it's really pretty funny just to see this kind of evidence. Another one is the Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III, again dating to the 9th century BC, about 825, from Nimrod. And this is in modern-day Nineveh Governorate in Iraq. You can find this. I've seen this in the British Museum. If you're ever in London, I highly recommend the British Museum. You can find a bunch of biblical artifacts in that museum that are quite interesting. If you zoom in here, you can see King Jehu bowing in subjection to the Assyrian king. The Assyrians were quite the oppressors. I mean, they're like impaling people, and it's just horrible. But one of the interesting things we'll get to in a minute is a case where they didn't succeed. And so, yeah, here it is. If you remember, or some of you might know, in 2 Kings 19 and Isaiah 37, it gives the account of King Hezekiah, one of the few godly kings in this era. And the Assyrians have conquered a lot of the neighboring cities, and they've come now to Jerusalem, and they're surrounding it. And so he's worried, he's praying, these people are so powerful. It's a much bigger nation than Israel. How could we possibly resist them? We've got to get help from God. And sure enough, we find on Sennacherib's prism, this Assyrian king, he's listing all these cities they've conquered. There's like 47 cities mentioned. They conquered 46, but there's one notable exception, and yes, it's Jerusalem. And he does still try to brag about it. He's like, I caged the king of Jerusalem up like a bird and all this stuff, but he can't say that he conquered it because he didn't. And so that's pretty significant. There you can see how they treated people. They were very vicious. You did not want to be conquered by them, and if you resisted, you'd be the one impaled as an example. All right, so it does seem somewhat miraculous that tiny Judah could survive against mighty Assyria, but we know for sure that they did, and we have independent evidence from the famous Greek historian Herodotus, sometimes called the father of history, that records that Sennacherib's army was afflicted with the bubonic plague or something similar to that in about that time frame, and that matches the biblical account where it talks about the angel of the Lord struck them down with, it doesn't give a lot of details, but it would at least fit that kind of description from Herodotus. And we have other evidence of Hezekiah, just as kind of a brief tangent here. It's interesting, they built this tunnel when they knew the Assyrians were conquering other people and they might come to them. They're like, hey, we need a water source if we're going to survive a siege. So they connected this spring outside the walls with something inside the walls. They tried to hide it and all that. So then they would have a water source during the siege. And it was 1,000 feet. They had to dig through this solid stone. And no one knew about this until, I think it was like the 1800s or something. And so you could go visit that if you ever go to Israel and see this tunnel. And as you can see there's still some water in it in that particular picture because it is connected to a spring. So that's pretty cool. And we also have his wall, archaeological evidence of his wall. So really, as you get newer, as you get more recent, you do get a lot more confirmations of these kind of details because more things survive to the present. You do have a problem, though, excavating anywhere in Israel that's near like the Temple Mount. You could start a major world war by making the Muslims too mad, and it's a very sensitive area. So I think that's why it took so long to find artifacts associated with King David, because most of those were just right there near this sensitive Temple Mount area. Another interesting one is the so-called Cyrus cylinder. So here we're getting even more recent. King Cyrus of Persia conquered Babylon, and he issued a decree, you might remember in Ezra and Nehemiah. He's letting them go back. And if you go back far enough, like 100, 200 years ago, all the skeptics were like, this is so unrealistic. Why would they let people go back to their homeland once you've conquered this nation? They didn't think that ever happened. But I mean, we now have artifacts like this that show actually Cyrus, the very person that claims, let them go back. He did have more of a religious tolerance kind of mindset. He was like, well, the people will be less likely to rebel against us if we treat them right, give them religious freedom. So he did, and we have that recorded. All right, another one that's really interesting that we're getting basically at the end here. See how we're doing on time. So the book of Daniel gets a lot of attention because it makes all these prophecies. Many of, it talks about these kingdoms. It sounds a lot like a history book talking about, 100 to 400 BC. And so people are like, well, it must have just been written in like 100 or 200 BC or something. But the interesting thing is, I mean, there's really no evidence of that. It has a lot of coherence. And it's proven to be quite accurate. It's like whoever wrote it had to have known what was going on at the time it was claimed to have been written. For example, in Daniel, it talks about the last king of Babylon, and it mentions Belshazzar. And no one had ever heard of Belshazzar, so they thought, well, this is clearly wrong. Daniel is just making this up. And in fact, they were relying on, again, this guy Herodotus that I mentioned. He's writing in the 5th century. Daniel would have been, like 100 years before that, roughly. And this Herodotus historian said that it was Nabonidus got a lot of evidence for Nabonidus being the last king of Babylon. Okay, so what goes on? That does sound like a mistake in the Bible, admittedly. Okay, but we eventually found an artifact that showed that Belshazzar was Nabonidus' son and that he was in charge in Babylon for several years because Nabonidus went away to worship some moon god in some palace, something like that. So he was gone for years, and this was more like a co-regency. But the one that was king in Babylon near the end was actually Belshazzar. So Daniel got it right, and how would he have known that if it was written in like 100, 200 BC or something? Yeah, Kevin.
This might be in another bullet point, but in so I may be jumping the gun a little bit. Daniel, when Daniel is given authority in Babylon in this time, text says that he's like the third most powerful.
Yeah.
So if he's third, there's got to be two people above him. So it's Belshazzar and somebody else.
There you go.
The text doesn't explicitly name.
Very good point. I do actually have that mentioned. So no, I'm glad you brought it up though, because it shows that it's awesome. There it is. Yeah, that's great though. No, I'm glad you brought that up. You're thinking very sharply there. Yeah, it only makes because it talks about him like, wow, you're this great interpreter and all this stuff. Let's put you in charge. Why third? It doesn't really say in the text, but if you know this backstory from history, it fits perfectly. All right. So just a couple real quick things. One of the things archaeologists want to focus on sometimes is this notion of provenance. We'll talk about that more next week. Some of the artifacts they find sometimes just show up on the antiquities market. Somebody finds it and they're just trying to sell it. It's not ideal, right? Because then you don't know for sure. Like you have to take their word for where it came from and stuff like that. So there's been a number of those, but often, it's not that often that people are really able to pull off forgeries because modern archaeologists are really good at detecting the age of things. And there's this notion of like a patina where you can really see if this thing aged for 2,000 plus years, 2,500 years. It's almost impossible to fake that, basically. So that helps a lot. So we found, for example, Hezekiah's seal. And people would question it because it was unprovinced. And then we find later during an official excavation, oh, that's the same thing. I guess that was fine. Same thing with Baruch's seal. This is someone mentioned in the book of Jeremiah as a scribe who wrote it. And also, I think they cleaned it. They wanted to sell it, make it look better. It's like, why did you do that? You're messing up the evidence that it was old. But again, we find something later and it shows, yep, this was legit because there's multiple of these. Often, they would have these seals to show that it was an official document, so they'd have a bunch of them made. So, yeah, they discovered that, and then it's exactly the same, basically. All right, so that's all I got, and it's a good stopping place. But anything else you guys want to discuss, or if there's questions, we can do that in the last couple minutes here, and if not, we can let you out early. Yeah.
I kind of had a more epistemological question that I've been trying to think through. We talked at the beginning about absence of evidence is not evidence of absence.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of wondering about the extent to which that's true, because it makes me seem as what I've been thinking about is a very conspicuous absence of evidence might qualify as evidence
Yeah.
of absence, and I'm wondering if there's any sort of heuristic by which one can kind of judge that you're aware of.
That's a very good question. Yeah, that's why I added this necessarily caveat, because it is certainly true that there are cases where absence of evidence could be evidence of absence if you really have really good reasons for expecting it. But I think when you're looking at archaeology, and especially if you're going back to like the early parts of the Old Testament, it's almost never a good argument there because not much is going to survive. But as you get newer, more recent, then yeah, it could get a little more debatable. But let's see what you guys think here.
The way I would frame it is how probable is it that you would find evidence there?
Exactly.
probability analysis.
Yeah.
Given a certain hypothesis, how likely is this evidence that we're finding?
What would you add, Rob?
Arguably, though, the how much absence question can be answered by requiring an amount of evidence before accepting something as true. If I claim to be the 46.5th president of the United States without providing any evidence,
Yeah,
you probably just dismiss that out of hand.
sure.
The one that I was thinking particularly about, it was kind of, it doesn't have to do with this. I was thinking about the lack of early evidence for the veneration of saints, and thinking about whether the absence of that in like the apostolic fathers and in really early Christian writings is sufficient to say that that was absent from the Christian tradition at the very beginning. And so that's like a question that I'm thinking.
That's an interesting one. I mean, we do have so many writings from the early church fathers. Now, admittedly, I guess it's sparser when you go all the way back to the very beginning, but.
I guess how you would phrase that is, we can't prove that they didn't, but we don't really have anything to suggest that they did.
Yeah. Tim McGrew, who's going to talk later, that's his area of expertise, is like epistemology and formal logic. And he has a lot to say because he's also incredibly knowledgeable about history. He gives a lot of examples of these kind of absence of evidence things falling under the bus from a historical standpoint, where he'll talk about like Marco Polo didn't mention the Great Wall of China, or you have Grant diary, his diary every day. He's telling everything that happened. It's like he just gives all this detail, but he doesn't mention the Emancipation Proclamation. But obviously we know it happened. So the other thing in general I would say is that you want to be careful not to think that authors would have to be compelled to mention something just because it's important to you. Sometimes they might have reasons for not mentioning it. But what do you think, Caitlin? Or sure. Yeah, we can move on from that. Sure. Good question. I mean, as a Christian, I have a certain feeling that God inspired this set of documents, and I think I have good evidence that Christianity is true and that Jesus affirmed the Bible. And then if you have Jesus affirming it, like there might be some books of the Bible where you don't have as much evidence, but because I'm viewing it under this lens of if Jesus really rose from the dead and we have all this evidence validating him, and he's validating the Old Testament, that gives me more confidence as well to maybe extrapolate from this part has good evidence, other parts we just don't have any one way or the other, but why assume it's wrong based on this framework? That might be one thing. Yeah. I do believe the Bible's inerrant, but it's like I've realized over time, like that's more of a secondary thing. I view that more because I believe in Jesus and his view of the Bible, and not like if the Bible wasn't inerrant and Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity is still true. And so even if there were some issues with the Bible and it was inaccurate, it wouldn't make me not be a Christian. And then the other thing is the doctrine of inerrancy itself is very nuanced in the terms of it applies only to the original writings. And if you have copyist errors, there are some known copyist errors, doesn't invalidate even that doctrine. So I don't know if that gets at your question exactly, but some other things in that general vicinity. Let's let Annabelle take questions since you haven't spoken up.
Depending on the denomination, like Orthodox, Baptist, or whatever, like they different importance, I guess, like on the scriptures, right? Like they was sola scriptura, versus like like in Orthodox they have additional books of the Bible, right? And it's less like scripture breathed by God, I guess.
They would sort of focus a lot on church tradition as well for the Roman Catholics, at least. I don't know as much about the Orthodox. Rob?
I was going to bring up something I realized. When we look at the cylinder of Cyrus, from what I understand, don't give those supernatural mentions much credibility. So I guess this would kind of tie back to what you were saying earlier about the limitations of this. This doesn't point to evidence of the supernatural acts of God, just the historical
Yeah.
existence of the Israelite people or Hebrew people in certain places at certain times.
Yeah, we want to validate, like, was it written early? Was it accurate? Do you have people just making stuff up? Do you have something that's intersecting well with history? But yeah, I can't really, even if I find a bunch of inscriptions about the Red Sea being parted, that's no more evidence than just it being claimed in the text.
There was, before that was found, there was skepticism that Cyrus ever would have had such a policy.
Right, yeah. So that's why I mentioned some of those particular artifacts, because they intersected with skeptical challenges and things like that. Seth?
One, I was just going to comment going off of Rob's thing. We did mention the whole walls of Jericho falling outward, which I would say goes a bit further past just.
It does, actually,
Israel
yeah.
existed. That actually could, depending on how strong that is, that could be pointing to that miracle actually happening as it seemed in time. But totally unrelated question. I was going to ask, what's your like thoughts on like the idea of like the Bible mentioning like 2 million people, or if you add on the women and the children, it being like somewhere around 2 million people going across the Sinai Peninsula, and that
Okay.
being an extreme amount of people that you would really think we'd have some evidence for.
That's a good question. That's interesting you bring that up. Yeah, when I was taking my archaeological course a while back, that was the first time I heard that even sort of conservative evangelical scholars think that some of the translations of the Old Testament may be wrong, that actually that word translated thousand could be like a family or some kind of unit. And so there might have been smaller numbers. And as I was, even recently, I see like Titus Kennedy, I see a bunch of conservative Christian archaeologists also pointing that it's not certain. It's more of just like maybe, there were ancient Hebrew. We don't have as many, just examples of usages. It's harder to know what the words mean. And we have far fewer words in their vocabulary than you do like even ancient Greek or especially modern English, where we have like 1 million words. So it's like the same word can mean 3 or 4 different things. We have that in English too, but you have it in spades in some of the ancient languages. And so I think there is a legitimate potential interpretation that could have resulted in these being smaller numbers. And I don't have a strong view like it necessarily has to be that way or not, but more of, if that's true, that it was really referring to the smaller numbers, then that would also point to, well, there's a smaller expectation of what evidence you would find, the smaller the number of people. It also seems logistically easier, but I mean, you did have God helping these people and guiding them and feeding them, so that part doesn't concern me really, but. It's a bit much, yeah. It is kind of high. Yeah, it's not impossible or anything, but it would have been. Because the other thing, like even if you read the Old Testament, it's like it says, God says, I chose you, Israel, because you were the least of the nations. It's like it's saying like you're really small. So yeah, I think there's a pretty good case that could be made that.
If they were small, it seems to make their conquest of the Canaanites seem even more miraculous if they were
Yeah.
smaller and were able to still basically steamroll that entire
Yeah.
region of the world.
Yeah. So yeah, I think that's one of the things. Or if you get more information about ancient languages, you at least see that, hey, that is a very viable potential interpretation, at least. All right, we're out of time at just the right moment here, I think. So yeah, thanks for you guys being here, and we'll talk New Testament next week. That gets real fun. More implications for Christianity directly there. And hopefully you guys can make it out